All right, so you sent us some excerpts talking about the origins of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And, some of these claims really kind of challenge what most of us learned
Yes.
in, growing
In
up.
school, yeah.
In school, yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
Your source material really throws a wrench
Yeah.
into conventional timelines,
Yeah.
suggesting a much more interconnected
Okay.
and, let's be honest,
Yeah.
controversial view of how these religions developed.
Mm-hmm.
It even goes so far as to say that Judaism, as we know it,
Right.
emerged after Christianity.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's definitely not what I remember from history class.
No.
So our mission today is to figure out,
Yeah.
is there actual evidence
Right.
for these claims?
Yeah.
And if so,
Uh-huh.
what does it mean for how we understand these religions today?
Exactly. To even begin to tackle this,
Yeah.
we need to start with the foundation, Yahwism.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of it?
Vaguely, but honestly, I couldn't give you a clear definition.
No problem. That's why we're here. Yahwism is the ancient Israelite religion,
Okay.
centered on the worship of Yahweh,
Right.
who we know as God.
Mm.
Picture the ancient Near East, where polytheism, worshiping multiple gods, was the norm.
Yeah.
Yahwism emerged in that context.
Okay.
What's fascinating is that early on,
Yeah.
Yahwism seems to have coexisted with other deities.
Okay.
We even have archaeological evidence suggesting that Yahweh was sometimes worshipped,
Well,
alongside gods like Baal or Asherah.
wait, seriously.
Yeah,
Yahweh sharing space with other gods.
that was pretty common back then.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So how did this divine melting pot, as you call it,
Yeah.
transition into the strict monotheism
Right.
we see in the Abrahamic faiths?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's where things start to get really interesting.
Okay.
The Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE seems to have been a pivotal moment.
Oh.
This period of upheaval and forced displacement
Right.
for the Israelites
Yeah.
appears to have led to a hardening
Yeah.
of monotheistic beliefs.
Cut
The
out.
prophet Isaiah, for example,
Yeah.
declares, I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God.
Oh, wow.
You can find that in Isaiah 45.5.
Okay, that's a pretty strong statement for sure.
Yeah.
But how widespread was this belief at the time? Was it really a defining moment for Yahwism?
That's where the debate lies.
Okay.
Some scholars believe this period marks a clear shift toward the strict monotheism we see in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Right.
They even suggest that this early exclusive focus on Yahweh
Yeah.
represents what they call pre-Quranic Islam.
Okay.
Essentially, they argue that the core concept of Islam,
Yeah.
submission to God's will,
Right.
existed long before the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay, now that is a mind-blowing concept.
It is.
So are we saying that figures like Abraham
Yeah.
were essentially Muslim?
That's a bold claim. And to be clear, pre-Quranic Islam
Yeah.
doesn't mean these early Israelites followed all the practices or beliefs of Islam as we know it today.
Right.
It's more about recognizing a potential continuity of the core idea, submission to one God. This aligns with the Quranic view that God sent prophets to every nation,
Right.
calling people to worship him alone.
Okay.
So there were prophets in all different areas
Yeah.
calling people to the worship of one God.
All right, so we're starting to see how Yahwism could be connected to later Abrahamic traditions.
Right.
But what about Judaism specifically?
Yeah.
Where does that fit into this whole pre-Quranic Islam idea?
That's where things get even more fascinating. I have to understand that we
Yeah.
need to trace the lineage from Jacob,
Okay.
also known as Yaqub,
Wait.
to the 12 tribes of Israel. This is key to understanding early Israelite identity,
Okay.
which was primarily based on family ties
Okay.
rather than a formalized religion.
So you're saying their connection wasn't so much about a shared belief system,
Right.
but about being descendants of Jacob.
Exactly. They were united by blood ties
Okay.
and a shared ancestry,
Gotcha.
not necessarily by adherence
Yeah.
to a codified set of religious laws or doctrines.
That's a pretty different way of thinking about religious identity
It is.
than what we're used to today. So if they weren't practicing Judaism yet,
Right.
what exactly was their relationship with Yahweh like?
Picture the period of the Judges,
Okay.
a time before kings in ancient Israel. It was a time of direct divine guidance,
Okay.
where leaders like Deborah
Yeah.
a prophetess who led the Israelites to victory,
Right.
or Gideon, who defeated a much larger army with only 300 men,
Oh, wow.
received instructions directly from God.
Okay.
There was no centralized human authority,
Gotcha.
just direct communication
Yeah.
between God and the Israelites.
So it sounds like a theocracy
Right.
with God as the ultimate ruler. And that connects back to the pre-Quranic Islam idea.
Yes.
Submitting to God's will without the need
Yeah.
for human intermediaries.
Precisely. It's a fascinating parallel.
Yeah.
But then, of course,
Yeah.
things change.
Okay.
Eventually, the Israelites demand a king,
Okay.
despite warnings from prophets like Samuel,
Mm-hmm.
who cautioned them against rejecting God's direct leadership.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is.
They had this direct line to God,
Yeah.
but they still craved a human king,
Right.
someone they could see and relate to.
It is ironic.
Yeah.
And that transition to kingship marks a significant shift
Right.
away from direct divine guidance.
Okay.
And it sets the stage
Yeah.
for another important development: the emergence of Judaism
Yeah.
as a distinct religion.
So this is where it gets really interesting.
Yes.
But tell me, isn't it usually assumed that Judaism predates Christianity?
It is, yeah.
How does the source material explain this seemingly backward timeline?
That's the bombshell, isn't it? It completely flips the script
Yeah.
on how we usually think about these two religions.
Right.
To understand this, we need to look at what happened after the Babylonian exile.
Okay.
Around the 6th century BCE,
Mm-hmm.
those returning from exile began formalizing their practices
Okay.
and compiling texts that would eventually form the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
But even then, it wasn't quite Judaism as we know it today.
Gotcha.
It was still primarily Yahwism,
Okay.
practiced by the people of Judah,
Right.
and the idea of a distinct Jewish identity wasn't fully formed.
So things were getting more organized,
Yes.
but not yet a fully defined religion.
Right.
So how did Christianity play a role
Well,
in the emergence of Judaism?
Christianity introduced some radical concepts
Okay.
that challenged traditional Yahwistic understanding.
Right.
The idea of Jesus as the Messiah,
Right.
the Son of God.
Uh-huh.
These were theological innovations
Right.
that created a clear dividing line within the existing Israelite community.
So for those who held on to the traditional Yahwistic belief in one God and the prophets up to Moses,
Yeah.
defining themselves against those who embraced Jesus
Yes.
became crucial.
It did.
So it's like Christianity forced a clarification
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
identity.
Uh-huh.
Suddenly, it wasn't enough to just say,
Right. Yeah.
I'm an Israelite who worships Yahweh.
Exactly.
You had to take a stance
Yeah.
in relation to this new,
Right.
rapidly spreading faith.
And that's where the term Judaism might have emerged
Okay.
around the 6th century CE.
Gotcha.
It became a way to solidify a separate identity for
Oh.
those who rejected Jesus's claims
Right.
and wanted to distinguish themselves from Christians.
That's a really interesting point.
It is.
So are we saying that the core beliefs and practices
Yes.
didn't necessarily change dramatically,
That's the argument. Yes.
but the need for a distinct label,
Right.
a way to differentiate themselves,
Yeah.
is what gave rise to the term Judaism?
Yeah. It's less about a sudden theological shift
Uh-huh.
and more about a social and political need
Right.
for clear boundaries
Yeah.
in a changing religious landscape.
Gotcha.
Interestingly, this idea echoes the concept of Islam without Jesus,
Okay.
where both Judaism and this early form of Islam
Right.
share the belief in one God
Okay.
and the prophets up to Moses.
Okay.
The key difference lies in the acceptance or rejection
Yeah.
of prophets who came after Moses,
Okay.
particularly Jesus.
Gotcha.
They share a common root,
Mm-hmm.
but branch out in different directions.
Right. All right, so we've established that the timeline of Judaism and Christianity might be a bit more complex than we initially thought.
Yeah, it's
But
definitely...
before we get too deep into that, you mentioned this idea of
Yeah, yeah.
linguistic obfuscation last time.
Yes.
And I have to admit,
Uh-huh.
I'm still a bit fuzzy on what that actually means.
It's a fascinating concept.
Okay.
And it's key to understanding how our perceptions of history can be skewed. Essentially, linguistic obfuscation
Yeah.
refers to the idea that language isn't static.
Okay.
It evolves over time, words change meanings,
Right.
and this evolution can obscure historical truths.
Okay.
It's like trying to read a map
Mhm.
where all the landmarks have been renamed.
Ah, okay. I'm starting to see the problem. You might think you're following the directions perfectly,
Right.
but you end up totally lost
Yeah.
because the language on the map no longer reflects the reality on the ground.
Precisely. And when it comes to religious history, this linguistic shift can have a huge impact.
Yeah.
The source material you provided gives a really interesting example.
Okay.
The letter J.
Okay.
Did you know that the J sound didn't even exist in ancient languages?
Wow, really?
So terms like Jerusalem or Jew, words we associate with ancient history, are actually later developments.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that the people we call Jews today didn't even refer to themselves as Jews back then?
It's a mind-bending concept, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it highlights how linguistic changes can create a disconnect between our modern understanding and the historical reality.
Okay.
It's like we're looking at the past through a distorted lens.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if Jew is a later term, what do those who followed Yahwism before Jesus call themselves?
Well,
I mean, they were still Israelites, right?
Exactly. Their primary identity was rooted in their lineage. They were descendants of Jacob, also known as Yaqub.
Right.
It was a familial connection, a shared ancestry, not a religious label.
Okay.
Their practice of Yahwism centered on their relationship with Yahweh, their God, rather than adherence to a strict set of religious doctrines.
So it sounds like the emphasis was more on kinship and a direct connection with God.
It was.
Rather than a structured, formalized religion.
Precisely. And this distinction is crucial because it challenges the traditional assumption that Judaism existed in its current form from the time of Moses or Abraham. Your source material argues that what we call Judaism crystallized much later as a response to the rise of Christianity.
All right, so let's get back to that response to Christianity idea.
Okay.
How did the emergence of Christianity as a distinct religion shape the development of what we now know as Judaism?
Well, think of it this way. Christianity introduced some radical concepts that challenged traditional Yahwistic understanding. The idea of Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God. These were theological innovations that created a clear dividing line within the existing Israelite community. For those who held on to the traditional Yahwistic belief in one God and the prophets up to Moses, it became necessary to define themselves in contrast to those who embraced these new Christian beliefs.
So it's like Christianity forced a clarification.
It did, yes.
Identity.
Right.
Suddenly, it wasn't enough to just say, I'm an Israelite who worships Yahweh.
Exactly.
You had to take a stance in relation to this new, rapidly spreading faith.
And that's where the term Judaism might have emerged around the 6th century CE as a way to solidify a distinct identity for those who rejected Jesus's claims. It was less about the emergence of a completely new set of beliefs and practices and more about drawing a clear boundary in response to this new religious landscape.
So in a way, it was a reaction to external pressure.
It was.
It wasn't so much that the beliefs themselves changed dramatically, but rather that the need for a clear label, a way to differentiate themselves, became more important in the face of this new challenge.
That's a great way to put it. It's a pattern we see throughout history, how religious identities often solidify and become more defined in response to external pressures or challenges. And this brings us back to the concept of Islam without Jesus that we discussed earlier. Both Judaism and this early form of Islam share a belief in one God and the prophets up to Moses. The key divergence comes with the acceptance or rejection of the prophets who came after Moses, particularly Jesus. They share a common root, but branch out in different directions.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. But we've been focusing a lot on Judaism and Christianity.
We have.
What about the Islamic perspective on all of this? Where does the Quran fit into this whole picture?
That's a crucial question. The Quran doesn't see itself as just another Abrahamic religion that appeared on the scene after Judaism and Christianity. It claims to be both a confirmation and a correction of earlier revelations. It acknowledges the Torah and the Gospels as containing divine truth, but it also points out distortions or misinterpretations that crept in over time.
So it's like the Quran is saying, hey, there's truth in those older books, but here's the complete picture. The original message restored and clarified.
Exactly. It's about getting back to the essence of monotheism,
Okay.
submitting to the one God.
Right.
And the Quran emphasizes that this isn't a new idea.
Okay.
It states that all prophets, from Adam to Muhammad,
Right.
called people to worship God alone.
Okay.
So, in a sense, it argues that Islam,
Yeah.
as a concept of submitting to God's will,
Right.
has always existed.
Wow. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is.
But if we consider the idea of pre-Quranic Islam,
Right.
it starts to make sense.
It's like the Quran is saying...
This isn't a new religion. It's the original religion.
Yeah. Right.
The one that all prophets preached.
Yes, yes.
Now restored to its purest form.
And precisely. And this perspective has some fascinating implications for how we understand the relationship between these Abrahamic faiths.
Yep.
It's not about seeing them as competing ideologies,
Right.
but rather as different expressions of a shared monotheistic core.
Gotcha.
They're all part of a single narrative,
Yeah.
a story of humanity's ongoing search for connection with the divine.
Okay, so we've got Yahwism
Yes.
as this early form of monotheism,
Uh-huh.
Judaism solidifying in response to Christianity,
Right.
and the Quran presenting itself as the confirmation and correction of all that came before.
Yeah.
But if these traditions are all rooted
Right.
in this shared monotheistic core,
Uh-huh.
why are they so different? Why the divisions?
That's where things get really complex
Right.
and where we see the impact of linguistic obfuscation.
Right.
Remember how we talked about
Yeah.
language evolving and potentially obscuring meaning over time?
Right.
Well, imagine that happening over centuries
Yeah.
across different cultures and languages.
Right.
It's inevitable that misunderstandings,
Yeah.
misinterpretations,
Right.
and even deliberate distortions
Yeah.
would arise.
It's like a giant game of telephone
It is.
where the message gets garbled as it's passed from person to person,
Right.
across generations and continents, right?
Yes.
Add to that the human element biases,
Yes.
political agendas, the desire to control or manipulate.
Right.
And it's no wonder that these religious traditions,
Yeah.
despite sharing a common origin,
Yes.
have diverged in significant ways.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And when you consider the historical context, the
Oh.
power dynamics,
Yeah.
the translation and reinterpretation of
Yeah.
sacred texts over time,
Right.
it becomes clear that maintaining a pure,
Yeah.
undistorted message is incredibly challenging.
This all makes sense.
Yeah.
But it also raises a troubling question.
Uh-huh.
If language itself can obscure the truth
Yeah.
about these shared monotheistic roots,
Yeah.
what other historical or religious narratives might be distorted
It's a good question.
or even fabricated?
Yeah.
It's kind of unsettling to think about.
It is a bit unsettling, but it's also a powerful reminder
Okay.
of the importance of critical thinking
Yeah.
and questioning assumptions.
Right.
It's not about rejecting everything we've been taught,
Right.
but about approaching information with a discerning mind, considering multiple perspectives,
Yeah.
and being open to the possibility that our understanding might be flawed.
Okay.
And who knows,
Yeah.
maybe by peeling back these layers of linguistic
Yeah.
and historical obfuscation,
Right.
we can rediscover a more unified and harmonious understanding of our shared human story.
That's a hopeful thought.
Yeah.
But before we get too carried away with visions of interfaith harmony, we need to address a pretty big claim from the source material.
Okay.
It suggests that key figures
Okay.
in early Islamic history,
Yeah.
people like Aisha and Abu Huraira, might not have even existed.
Right.
That's a pretty shocking statement to drop.
It is. Yeah.
In the middle of all this talk about monotheism and historical reframing.
It is a provocative claim,
Yeah.
and it really highlights how we construct historical narratives
Right.
and the importance of scrutinizing our sources.
Okay.
The source material argues that figures like Aisha and Abu Huraira
Yeah.
are primarily known through hadith literature.
Okay.
Those are collections of sayings and stories
Right.
attributed to the Prophet Muhammad
Mhm.
that were compiled centuries after his death.
Wait, centuries after?
Mm.
Isn't that like writing a biography of George Washington?
It is.
Based on rumors and legends passed down for generations?
Yeah.
How can we be sure those accounts are accurate? I mean,
good question.
no archaeological evidence.
Right.
No contemporary accounts.
Yeah.
Nothing.
That's exactly the point
Okay.
the source material is trying to make.
Okay.
It's not necessarily saying that these figures were completely fabricated,
Right.
but it does raise serious questions about the reliability of Hadith literature as a historical source, especially when it comes to reconstructing events from the early Islamic period.
Okay, so if we're questioning the historicity of key figures in early Islam based on Hadith literature, where does that leave us?
That's a good question.
What other sources can we rely on to understand this critical period in Islamic history?
The source material points to the Quran itself as the primary and most reliable source of guidance for Muslims. It emphasizes that the Quran is a complete and sufficient revelation, and it cautions against relying on conjecture or unverified claims.
So it's back to basics, focusing on the core text
Exactly.
and being wary of later interpretations or additions that might have strayed from the original message.
Yeah, exactly. It's about prioritizing the Quran as the foundation of Islamic understanding and being critical of secondary sources that might contain distortions or fabrications.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking.
It is.
But I can already hear some pushback from those who consider Hadith literature essential to Islamic practice and belief. How do we reconcile
That's a good question.
these seemingly contradictory viewpoints?
It's a complex issue that requires open and honest dialogue within the Muslim community. It's not about dismissing Hadith literature entirely, but about approaching it with a discerning mind, recognizing its limitations, and always prioritizing the Quran as the ultimate source of truth. It's about seeking a balanced and informed understanding that honors both the historical context and the divine message.
That makes sense. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from linguistic obfuscation to pre-Quranic Islam to the potentially fabricated origins of key Islamic figures. It's been an intense exploration.
I agree. It's been a whirlwind, but hopefully it's been enlightening as well.
It has.
It's a reminder that our understanding of history, religion, and even ourselves is constantly evolving.
Wow, that last segment really got me thinking.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much we take for granted when it comes to history.
And
how easily narratives can be shaped or even distorted over time.
We often forget that history is not just a collection of facts. It's also a process of interpretation. And that interpretation can be influenced by so many factors. From language and culture.
Power dynamics and personal biases.
Exactly. And speaking of challenging our assumptions, the source material you provided takes a pretty fascinating leap in this final section. Connecting these ancient religious ideas to something completely different, modern physics.
Yes, and it's a connection that might surprise some listeners. We've been talking about Yahwism, Judaism, and Islam. But now we're venturing into the realm of quantum field theory, or QFT. What's fascinating is that QFT presents a picture of reality that in some ways echoes the core concept of Tawhid. The Islamic principle of divine unity.
Now that's a connection I did not see coming.
It is a big jump.
We're going from ancient texts to the cutting edge of science. I'm definitely intrigued. But I have to admit, I'm a bit lost. Can you break this down for me? What exactly is QFT and how does it relate to Tawhid?
Of course. To understand QFT, we need to shift our thinking away from the classical Newtonian view of physics. The one where the universe is like a giant clockwork mechanism with solid objects moving through empty space.
So we're not talking about apples falling from trees anymore?
Not quite. In QFT, the universe isn't seen as a collection of separate, independent objects. Instead, reality is understood as a web of interconnected fields. Imagine it like a vast ocean of energy with waves rippling and interacting.
I'm starting to get the picture. So where do particles fit into this ocean of energy?
Well, in QFT, particles aren't seen as fundamental building blocks of matter.
Okay.
Instead, they're understood as temporary excitations
Okay.
or disturbances within these underlying fields.
Okay.
It's like a wave rising and falling in the ocean.
Right.
The wave is a distinct phenomenon,
Yeah.
but it's ultimately inseparable from the ocean itself.
So it's less about solid objects.
Yep. And more about energy flowing and fluctuating,
Right.
creating the illusion of separate particles.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this interconnectedness is crucial. QFT suggests that there's no such thing as true separation.
Okay.
Everything is fundamentally linked at the level of these underlying fields.
Okay.
And that's where the connection to Tawhid comes in.
Okay, I'm starting to see the link here.
Yeah.
Tawhid emphasizes the oneness of God,
Right.
the idea that God is the sole source and sustainer of all creation.
Yeah.
So is the idea that this interconnected web of fields in QFT
Yeah.
could be seen as a manifestation of that divine unity?
That's one way to interpret it.
Okay.
Instead of seeing the universe as a machine made of distinct parts,
Yeah.
QFT encourages us to see it as a unified whole,
Right.
interconnected and interdependent.
Yeah.
And this idea resonates with the concept of a single, all-encompassing God who is both the source and the sustainer of all existence.
It's like science is catching up to what spiritual traditions have been saying for millennia.
Yeah.
That there's an underlying unity to all things, a divine order that transcends our limited human perception.
I love that. It highlights the potential for harmony
Yeah.
between scientific and spiritual perspectives for
Right.
centuries,
Yeah.
especially in the West.
Right.
Scientific thinking has often been dominated by materialism.
Right.
The idea that matter is all that exists
Yeah.
and that everything can be reduced to purely physical processes.
Right.
But QFT challenges that view.
Okay.
It suggests that matter itself isn't fundamental.
Right.
It emerges from something deeper,
Yeah.
something more interconnected.
It's like we've been looking at the trees and
Right.
finally we're starting to see the forest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And QFT introduces even more mind-blowing concepts,
Okay.
like quantum fluctuations.
Yeah.
Even in the so-called empty space,
Yeah.
there's constant activity.
They're like,
Virtual particles popping into and out of existence,
wow.
creating a dynamic
Okay.
and ever-changing energy field.
Right. Hold on. So you're saying that empty space
Yeah.
isn't actually empty.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a true void.
That's what QFT suggests.
Wow.
And it's supported by experimental evidence.
Okay.
It's a radical departure
Yeah.
from the classical view of a static,
Rare.
empty space.
Right.
Instead, QFT presents a universe
Yeah.
that is teeming with energy and potentiality at its most fundamental level.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
So we've got this interconnected web of fields, particles popping in and out of existence.
Right.
And the idea that emptiness is an illusion.
Yeah.
It's definitely a shift in perspective.
It is.
But how does it all connect back to our earlier discussions about Yahwism,
Yeah.
Judaism, and the evolution of monotheism?
Well, remember how we talked about pre-Quranic Islam?
Yeah.
The idea that submission to God's will existed long before the Prophet Muhammad?
Right.
If QFT is revealing a universe
Yeah.
that is fundamentally unified, interconnected, and sustained by a dynamic energy field,
Right.
it's not hard to see parallels with the concept of a single,
Yeah.
all-encompassing God
Right.
who is both the source and the sustainer of all creation.
It's like science is rediscovering an ancient truth,
Yeah.
a truth that has been articulated in different ways throughout human history,
It has.
from the mystical insights of spiritual traditions
Right.
to the equations of modern physics.
That's beautifully put.
Yeah.
And it points to the need for a more holistic understanding of reality.
Yeah.
One that acknowledges the limitations of a purely materialistic worldview.
Right.
QFT is showing us that there's more to the universe than meets the eye.
Yeah.
That there are deeper layers of reality that we're only beginning to explore.
And maybe, just maybe,
Yeah.
those deeper layers point towards a reality that is not so different from the spiritual insights of our ancestors,
Right.
who recognize the interconnectedness of all things
Mm.
and the presence of a unifying force that transcends our limited human comprehension.
I couldn't have said better myself.
Yeah,
It's an exciting time to be alive.
it is.
A time of paradigm shifts and expanded horizons.
Yeah.
Who knows what other incredible discoveries await us
Yeah.
as we continue to explore the universe and our place within it.
Right.
The journey of understanding is never truly over.
Absolutely. And on that note,
Okay.
I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
We have.
It's been an incredible journey,
Yeah,
exploring the interconnectedness of history,
it has.
religion, and science. What are some key takeaways
Okay.
you'd like our listener to ponder as they continue their own explorations?
First, I'd say to remember that our understanding of the past is always evolving.
Okay.
Language, culture, and power dynamics can all shape our interpretations of history.
Right.
And it's crucial to be aware of those influences. Second,
Yeah.
don't be afraid to question assumptions and challenge conventional narratives.
Right.
There's always more to learn.
Yeah.
And sometimes digging deeper reveals surprising connections
Okay.
and alternative perspectives.
Right.
And finally, stay open to the possibility that science and spirituality are not necessarily opposed,
Yeah.
but can be complementary ways of understanding the universe and our place within it.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe the more we learn about the universe through science,
Right.
the closer we get to rediscovering ancient spiritual truths.
That's a beautiful thought
It is.
and a perfect way to wrap up our deep dive.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise.
Well, thank you for having me.
And to our listener,
Yeah.
keep those sources coming.
Yeah.
And we'll keep diving deep together.